Okay. Set. Okay. Red. Forgot to record. I got to regret that later. How's everybody? Hanging in there? Yeah. St. Patrick's Day is on Thursday. That's kind of fun. My kids were wandering around the house all morning, like screaming, the leprechaun is coming. I'm like, okay, what does that mean? But all right. Like, I think they're very excited too. They keep thinking they're going to catch the leprechaun. They're like, nobody ever has, but I'm going to. I'm like, okay, good luck. Right? I'm like, I wish you luck. I'm like, I won't tell them that I'm a leprechaun, but I'm like, whatever. They don't need to know. But I was going to say something else. Oh, the best news ever. The best news ever on Sunday. I was in the middle of eating cake and I got the best news on my phone about Tom Brady unretiring. Did anyone else see that? It made like my whole weekend. I was like, he's coming back, the old man. He's gonna get hurt because he's so old, but he's coming back. And it like absolutely made my whole weekend. So yeah, he's gonna stay on the Bucks for apparently one more season. We'll see. He's gonna play till he's like 80. He'll be back there with a walker. Just I'll take it. I was so sad. I cried when he retired, and then I was like, he's back for now, unless he like unretires again tomorrow. I don't know. He's pulling a Brett Favre, like retiring and coming back. But I'll take it as long as it lasts. I will take it. So that was my weekend. It was a wonderful day. 2 cakes because we had a big party, and Brady unretiring. I'm like, I'm not sure it gets any better than that for me anyway. I wanted to talk about a couple of things before we keep going. I want to talk about the guest speaker a little bit and just kind of highlight 1 or 2 things that I want to make sure that you look at in the slides. And then what we'll do is we'll move on to chapter 10. If you're looking at your syllabus, so on Thursday, what we'll do is we'll cover most of chapter 10. I actually have to end a little early today because I have a meeting with our new dean. It sounds like I'm in trouble or something, but that's not the case. But I have a meeting with our new dean, so I have to end a little early. But what we'll do is we'll talk about this. We'll talk a little bit about chapter 10. We'll finish it up on Thursday. And then next week on Tuesday, we have our second exam. And so I just want to make sure it's on your mind. It's going to be online, so you can use your notes and your book. We won't have class that day. So what will happen is it will be a virtual day. I will be here. And you're welcome to come here if you want to come sit in the classroom and take the test. But you can take it anytime on Tuesday. So it'll open up at 12 in the morning, like 12:01 a.m. and it'll close at 11:59 p.m. So you have the hour and 15 minutes of this class time to take it. But if you'd rather take it earlier or later in the day, you have the entire day to complete it. And again, my goal with that was to just allow you to have a little less anxiety. You don't have to sit in here and take a test and barely be able to breathe in your mask or feel anxious in any other way. And you can have your notes in your book. So I think it'll be really nice. There's really no reason you shouldn't all get really strong scores. It's the same format and style as the first test. But on Tuesday, we won't meet in person. It'll be a day where you can do that virtually. So I'll remind you again on Thursday, but and I'll post an announcement about it. But just to kind of put it on your mind, is that oh, I thought it was a hand. Are there any questions about that, about the test at all? Again, it'll be on Canvas and it'll open up. I set it to open, I think at 12:01 a.m. and then close at 11:59 p.m. So just make sure at some point on Tuesday you do take the test. Once it closes, it's too late. So you have the whole day, but again, you could take it at this time if you wanted to, since you'll have that time free. Okay. So other than that, what I want to do is talk a little bit about the guest speaker that we had. Now, I kind of feel like you got a little bit of like the raw end of the deal because she was late. So she was trying to hurry. I looked at her and I was like, you don't want to don't hand out the like practice. You only have 4 minutes left. And she's like, no, we'll get to it. Like, no, trust me, you have 4 minutes. It's not enough time. So I love that she handed it out. And then like 1 minute later, it was like, how many of you got to ask the question? Like they probably are still reading it, but that's okay. So I think it's a really difficult topic. Obviously, suicidality isn't easy, right? I'm sure a lot of you know people who at some point were either suicidal or attempted suicide or completed suicide. I can tell you that it was my least favorite part of counseling. Just when I would have clients who were suicidal, I would fear for their lives, right? I would stay up at night and worry that I wouldn't see them again at the next session. It was always something that's scary, right? You don't want somebody to take their life. You want to be there for them. Like Allison shared, sometimes there's only so much you can do, but you always want to try and do what you can, right? So my reaction, or my philosophy, I should say, with suicidality has always been that people will forgive me for doing too much, but can I forgive myself for not doing enough? That's kind of always been the way I've approached it, right? And she said people will never get mad at you. That hasn't been my case. That hasn't been the case for me my whole life. I've had people get mad at me for overreacting to their suicidality, but they often forgive me later, right? And I'm okay with them being a little mad at me if that means that I help them in some way, right? And so I won't say that that's always true. People sometimes will be upset with you, especially if you overreact. I think it was in here that she shared with her son, that her son said he was suicidal and she reacted really, really strongly, right? She didn't share that in my other class. I think it's important to know people, right? Like my brother, whenever anything bad happens, the first thing that he says is, I'm going to kill myself. Now, he's been saying that since he was little, and he's never really meant it. And so when he says it, I'm like, please, like, don't say that. Like, that's dumb. Because I can tease him and he's my brother, right? And I would never react to it strongly because I know that that's not actually how it's going to be. But if you have a close friend or a family member or somebody that you know, and they're acting really differently and you see those signs, right, you should take it seriously. But if you have people in your life who tend to say that kind of carelessly, I don't think you need to overreact to it. Now, should they be saying it? Probably not. But does that mean you have to react super strongly? Not always. But I think it's always better to do more than it is to do less. And in my 13 years that I've been here, I've walked 15 people to the health center. And I remember all 15 of them because it's just, it's a big deal. You want to make sure you take it seriously. But I would love to hear your thoughts. I don't know, did anyone find her presentation helpful, not helpful? This is between us. I'm not going to share it with her. But any thoughts or reactions to what she shared? Yeah.
Comes to like the story she told about her son.
Yeah.
I really don't know exactly, and the fact that her and his friend were just killed himself.
Yeah.
I understand that. But,
yeah.
It's that funny because I know a lot of people who, like, for example, they'll come to their parents with like, I'm not doing well, like I'm depressed, I don't feel good, like, and they'll just try to reach out to get some like help.
Yeah.
And they'll immediately like threaten to take them to a cycle.
Yeah.
And that is like, and then it like causes a lot of distrust.
Sure.
Between like them coming to their parents meeting. They feel like they can't actually talk to their parents about it anymore because they're afraid.
Yeah.
And then it just like turns into something where they don't have.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's like, I don't know, sometimes that's not the best avenue to go into, like immediately be like, okay, cycle.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you said that because I think that that's something that is very true for a lot of people. My parents were very much that way. Like if I expressed that I was struggling, it was like, we're going to react to the extreme. And then all it did for me was regret that I said anything. So I think it's important to be like, well, how can I help you? And what can I do to support you? But to be like, all right, I'm going to call 911 and have you put on like a 5150 and like walked away. What that does is make you feel like you can't say anything. So it's like such a fine line, right? Where you want to support that person, but you don't want to react in such a strong way that they feel like they can come to you. I think that's a really, really good point. Any other like general reactions or thoughts? I mean, helpful, not helpful at all? Any comments? Is that a yeah?
I would say like for the most part, my partner was asking me, I was the victim in that case.
Sure.
She was saying like, would you want help? And my first inclination as like a guy, like, no, I'll be fine.
Yeah.
And then so I kind of brushed off. And then at that point, we were kind of stuck on where to go because I feel like that's most people's reaction when they get asked, do you need help? No, I'll be fine. I'll walk it off.
Mm-hmm.
So
especially when you add like the gender stereotypes, right? Like very, very common, especially if you go like traditional male stereotypes of like, no, I'm strong and I'm fine and I've got this. I don't need help. And
worse before I can do it.
Yeah.
I'll be fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and I'm again glad you brought that up too. Like I think that a lot of you, and if you had had more time, to do the role play, maybe you would have run into more of that. But role plays are super awkward. period, right? Like regardless of where you do it, when you do them, they're awkward. But I like the point of it to get stuck in it, right? Like, or just to have the awkward moment of asking some of those questions. Maybe it's the first time you've asked something like that. But yeah, there's a lot of times where you get stuck. You ask somebody, your gut might tell you one thing, but what they say is another. And I think it doesn't always have to be a huge intervention. You know, sometimes if you have a friend or a family member who's seeming suicidal, just keeping them company, telling them you care about them, giving them a hug, like little things can go a long way too. It doesn't always have to be where you have a huge overreaction. But yeah, I mean, that's common. A lot of people be like, no, I'm fine, like, and backtrack out of it, for sure. The phone numbers that she gave you and the text line, those are really helpful. I actually have passed those on so many times. The text one especially. And so I really like, I mean, your generation's much more text like I don't even like to use my phone. But you know, most of us, I think, text more than anything, and that being able to text somebody at any hour and be like, I'm having a hard time. I think there's a little bit more of like a safety in that a lot of people appreciate. Those hotlines, though, they're almost always open. They're anonymous. They're not going to like call the police on you. You know, so if you ever find yourself stuck or have a friend who's in a bad spot, they're a great resource. So definitely hold on to those numbers. And again, I'm not going to necessarily cover chapter 7, but I just wanted to point out one or two things in the slides for this chapter. At the very, very least, I will definitely ask you, what does QPR stand for? Right? And you'll have a study guide. You know, as always, you'll have a study guide for the exam, but make sure that you know it stands for question, persuade, and refer. A lot of times people will say practice instead of persuade, right? So question, persuade, and refer. And it is a national program. So please, if you ever find that you're applying for something, whether it's to transfer or for a job in psychology, put that on there, that you've completed a QPR suicide prevention training. Or any little thing that you can put on a resume is helpful. So definitely put that on there. Know what QPR stands for. A couple other things in here just at the very beginning. So obviously read through chapter 7, right? I want to make sure that you go over the whole chapter on your own. But there is one question that I always ask on the exam and people find it confusing. So I just want to go over this really quickly. There tend to be 4 types of suicide that we talk about. Right? And so if I ask you on the exam, what are the 4 different types of suicide or like suicidal mentalities? It's these 4 right here. Sometimes people will guess at different methods of committing suicide, and that's not what I'm referring to. It's this. So I just want to point it out to you that sometimes we talk about death seekers, death initiators, death ignorers, and death darers, right? As 4 different kind of mentalities or thoughts around the idea of suicidality. So I just want to point that out so that if I do ask you that, you know what I'm talking about. And then again, you know, do make sure you read over the chapter and look over the slides. There's not a whole lot of them. There's only 9, but I did kind of highlight some of the key things in there since I knew we'd have a guest speaker. Are there any other like thoughts or comments or stories, anything at all else related to suicidality? I know a lot of you had great questions for her last time, which I think is fantastic. Yeah.
I think it's important to like let people know that if they do attempt trying to kill someone, then they fail. It's not.
Yeah, that's really, really an important thing to remember, that sometimes there's nothing you can do, right? If you try and help someone, do everything in your power, and they still decide to do that anyway, that's not on you, right? And that does happen, sadly, right? I guess for me, so I was a counselor trainee. I told you this at the beginning. Like I did 1,500 hours of being like a therapist training. So 1,500 hours of doing therapy, not getting paid for it. But as an intern, you often don't get paid for that. And I shifted away from it in the end. But like this by far was the hardest part for me. Like when somebody would come in and say like, I'm suicidal, you often have people fill out contracts when they're suicidal. Like I'm not going to harm myself between now and the next session, right? And it seems so silly, but you have somebody fill out like a legitimate, like they fill out a form and they sign it, saying that I will not kill myself before I see you next week, right? And that seems silly, but sometimes just that little like accountability can be enough. But as I said earlier, like I would lay awake at night and worry about my clients who were suicidal. Like it was, for me, I like this so much more because it's not so heavy. Like I wasn't bad at counseling. It was, for me, I cared too much. It was really hard for me to stop caring when I left and when I went home. And especially when I had clients who were suicidal, checking in on them, hoping that they would be all right. Because this can be something, like she said, it's a very permanent solution to what's often a temporary problem. But when people are in the depths of depression, it's often hard to see beyond the moment. So I think that's a really important thing to remember, that sometimes, you'll do everything in your power and it may or may not be enough. And that's not your fault, right? For sure. Any other thoughts or comments or anything? Yeah.
A resource you could use that's like for teenagers. So it's like, you're talking to trained professionals, you're talking to like teenagers who've been through like a rigorous training program. If you don't want to talk to someone who you feel like is a bit, I don't know, if you want to talk to someone that also relates more to like what you're, maybe not what you're going through, but like your age and all of that, then it's called a teen line. We did the text, Teen Talk is the texting one, and then Teen Line is the one we call.
Nice. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, there's a lot of great resources that are catered to certain communities, right? Whether it's like the LGBTQIA, we're adding more and more letters all the time, right? Sounds like a long sandwich to me every time. Of course, I equate it to food. I'm like, I'll have the LGBT, no tomatoes, right? Extra avocado, can we add avocado on it? I don't know. There's one for like every group, right? Teenagers, there's one for veterans. There's often one for people with, who identify as different orientations or genders. And so I think finding those, you're going to have better success if you're in that population with that group, most likely, because it's a little more catered to it. And I like that. I think it's important. Anything else? I had one other thought, but it just left me, so it'll come back. Oh, in my other class, so my other abnormal psych class, somebody asked, and I thought it was a good question, what about people who self-harm, right? That people sometimes might cut themselves or harm themselves in some way. Is that a sign of suicidality? And it can be, right? There are some disorders that have like self-harming or cutting as part of them, or that are very commonly part of them. Like, for example, borderline personality disorder tends to have some elements of self-harm that are often associated with it, sometimes a bipolar disorder. And so when somebody is harming themselves, if they're cutting themselves or hurting themselves in some way, that can definitely be a red flag. It doesn't always have to mean suicidality, but it's commonly like a flag that something is going on. So if you notice that a friend of yours or someone that you know is cutting themselves or harming themselves, that sometimes that's actually a coping mechanism, right? Where they're hurting themselves as a way to like release some of those emotions or to cope with the emotions that they're feeling. But it is kind of a flag, right? It might not necessarily indicate this, but it's something that you would want to take pretty seriously. So that came up in my other class, and I thought it was kind of a good question to kind of pass on. All right. So again, make sure you look the rest of that over. There's only a few slides, but it's definitely stuff that you will see on the exam that we'll have next week. And we're not going to get too far into this, like I said, and a few of you came in late, but like I have to stop early for a meeting, but I want to get at least a few slides in so that we have plenty of time to go over like the core of this on Thursday. What we'll do on Thursday as well is we'll do a little case study, kind of like we did with the eating disorder example, to pull it all together. A couple of really great like case studies, I think that make it easy to understand or kind of identify. So let me make this bigger. So we're not going to really get into the substances for us. What we're more interested in for our purposes are the disorders related to substance use. So that's what we'll focus on for the most part. Now, there are a lot of different psychoactive drugs. And if you're interested in that, you can take like the neuropsych class that we have here, and you would learn a little bit more about some of the mechanisms and how they work. You can definitely take whole classes. You can become an addiction counselor. There's a lot that you can learn about the different substances. We're going to focus mainly on the disorders. But I'll talk just a little bit about some of the substances and kind of set that stage a little bit today, and then we'll get into the disorders next time. And this is a tricky chapter. And a couple of you have asked me this about your characters that you have. Remember, when it comes to diagnosing someone, how there's always those two criteria, that it has to cause significant distress and impairment, and it cannot be due to the use of a substance or general medical condition. So here's where we bring in the substance piece, right? And so sometimes people have disorders as a result of using a substance, right? Their disorder is that substance use. And sometimes disorders can cause other issues, or I'm sorry, substance use can cause other issues. So for example, someone uses a lot of stimulants, it can cause anxiety, right? Or maybe you're using a lot of like opioids and it can cause depression. So we'll get to that more on Thursday. Let me pull this up here. But we're in this chapter, we're talking about the use of psychoactive drugs. And this is an absolutely massive group of substances. This is everything from like Tylenol and cough syrup, caffeine, which so many of you, right, just looking around have caffeine on your desks. I had mine already this morning, right? Like it's a very common substance, but a substance no less. To things like LSD and heroin and marijuana. I mean, this also includes anything that could be prescribed to you. Antidepressants, right, would fall into this group, where you can abuse prescribed medications just like you could abuse easily obtainable ones like caffeine, or some of the more like harder drugs that I mentioned as well. So this is just an absolutely massive group of substances. And in nearly every culture throughout time, people have sought ways to alter their consciousness, right? It's a very, very commonly practiced behavior. Though in the past, what we saw is that people use drugs more for like spiritual or traditional purposes, like as part of like a celebration or as part of like a spiritual journey. And now what we see is they're used a lot more for recreation. So people tend to use substances more for like to relieve boredom or to have fun or to like feel differently. So the use of substances has changed a little bit over time. But what we see is we have recorded history all the way back as long as we have had recorded history of people using substances. Now, when you take a substance of any kind, it can cause a temporary change in your behavior, emotion, or thought, or it could cause some long-term changes that lead to like maladaptive patterns of behavior. Most people can use a substance every now and then and not become addicted to it or dependent on it. But some people, when they use a substance even once, right, can cause like heavy issues with addiction or dependence, craving that drug, and so on. And the hard thing is you don't always know which way you're going to be, right? And so this can be something that's very short term, or it can be something much more long term. And those are the disorders that we'll talk about. There's really only two when we get there on Thursday. So as I said, I'm not going to go into these, but I do want to introduce, there's three main categories of substances that we tend to talk about. Let me grab my thing here. Where is my chalk? There it is. Okay, so three main groups. Depressants are up here. So depressants, just like they say, are chemicals that slow you down. They depress your system in some way. So they're going to inhibit your ability to think clearly, to make decisions clearly. A ton of different substances here. Some of the big ones being alcohol, sedative hypnotic drugs like the barbiturates and benzodiazepines, things like Xanax and Valium, things that people take to calm down, right? So alcohol, you might be like, oh, that seems like it would be a stimulant, right? Like oftentimes when you drink alcohol in the beginning, you might feel more stimulated and more up. But toward the end, it tends to have a very depressed effect, right? And oftentimes it depresses your ability or sedates your ability to think clearly, which is why people make bad decisions when they drink too much. But alcohol being the most common, as I said, barbiturates and benzodiazepines like Xanax and Valium. And then the opioids, morphine, heroin. We can also talk about endorphins, which are kind of our body's natural opioids. But these are some of the most common ones here. And again, they tend to have a very calming effect, very sedating, depressing your system and calming you down. Yeah. Yeah, there is a genetic piece to it, right? It tends to run in families a little bit more. So there is definitely somewhat of a genetic or a hereditary component to it. Yeah, it's not 100% of folks, but it's like in the 20s. I'd say it's like 27% or something like that.
So would it be like, if, for example, I have alcoholism or polycythemia, and I'm not an alcoholic, I don't think, and I think it can do it, but I get, I'm dependent on pills. Because of it, so would that be like a genetic thing where addiction runs around, maybe necessarily have to look for this specific stuff?
Yeah, and so that's the tricky thing, right? As we sometimes talk about addiction as being the main disease rather than the substance, right? And so, there's been talk of things like an addictive personality, but that's not necessarily something that is held up, right? It's more so that what we see is that oftentimes if somebody in your family, especially like a biological parent, has a propensity toward addiction, you might be slightly more vulnerable as their like biological child. But it doesn't always have to manifest in the same way. Right. And interestingly, if you have parents who are addicted, sometimes you get the opposite, where people have the like, I'm not going to take any substances. It might be, right, or through learning or just through, I don't want to be like my parents, and which is a very common like mentality a lot of us develop at some point. And so it could go either way, but there does tend to be a little bit of like a tendency to exhibit like addictive behaviors if it runs in the family. It doesn't always have to manifest the exact same way, like if it's alcohol. How do you mean?
Well, isn't like OCD, like an addictive behavior?
It's an anxiety behavior, right? But it's reinforced constantly. So with OCD, what you have is somebody has, an irrational thought. And so then they perform a ritualistic behavior to get rid of the irrational thought and the anxiety that comes from it. And so when you perform that behavior and the bad thing that you were afraid of doesn't happen, it becomes reinforced in conditioning. So it's more a result of like conditioning and reinforcement. And that's how you treat it. You have to break the like, reinforcement cycle, let's say. So it's more that than it is like related to addiction. But people do in a way, I can see where you're going with that. Become addicted to performing that behavior. It's more that they've been rewarded for performing it. Yeah.
So for addictions, is there a certain like amount of or an average amount of time someone like drinks or smokes for them to be addicted, or does it just vary a month?
So the criteria, and again, we'll get there on Thursday, the criteria is 12 months. Right, so you have to be using a substance in a variety of ways, having it affect your life in a variety of ways over the course of a year. So it doesn't have to be every day, but like that it's been a problem or a problematic like pattern or relationship for at least a year. So, that's where we get that idea of like a lot of people use substances, right? Again, caffeine, as mild as it seems, is a substance, right? And if you don't drink it, like if you don't have your coffee in the morning, you might feel awful. Right, like I drink coffee every day. If I don't have it, I get a headache. Right, technically, that's like tolerance and withdrawal. Right now, is caffeine super dangerous? No, right, but it could be problematic for people. Right, it can become dangerous and problematic if you're super reliant. So that gives you some gray area where you can use a substance every now and then not have a problem with it. So technically, it's weird. Was that a
Yeah, well, your answer. So you're saying that it has to impair. So what if it's always like that? That's what I mean. Like, I don't need to always do, and it's not to the point. But it's all the time. It's obviously.
So that would meet the criteria of like you spend a lot of time using or thinking about the drug. That's one of the criteria we'll talk about. Maybe you need more and more of it to get the same effect. So 1 beer used to do it, and now it's 12. Over time you have to have more and more. My uncle, oh my gosh, my uncle, he used to drink like 2 or 3 drinks, and that would be enough for him. Now he'll drink a whole case of beer every day, and it doesn't even do anything for him anymore, as he's just become so tolerant over time, and that's a criteria. So it might not necessarily get you into trouble, but that person's probably spending a lot of money on the alcohol that they're buying. They're drinking more and more of it. They would probably feel really awful if they didn't have it, and so that's where you start to meet the criteria. But again, like anything else, it's on a spectrum, right? So somebody might use a drug and abuse a drug and still maintain, their life pretty decently. Other people, get themselves into so much. Every disorder is almost that. Every single one. So it used to be that you either had it or you didn't. And then the DSM-5 made everything on a spectrum from mild to moderate to severe. So you actually rate on a scale from 1 to 5 with every single disorder to like specify how intense or severe it is for everyone. So every disorder technically exists on the spectrum from mild to profound or severe. So this is the first group, depressants, very commonly used and abused drugs. Stimulants, probably the most common. So with stimulants, these are any kind of drug or medication that is going to stimulate the sympathetic nervous system, producing feelings of like optimism and energy. Oftentimes people sleep very little as a result of using these substances. This is an incredible number of substances, from things like cocaine to amphetamines, which are more like typically pill-based, ecstasy, nicotine, caffeine, energy drinks are another one that we could add on here, which kind of blend a couple of different elements together of different herbs and substances and caffeine. But this is a lot of different substances, and they tend to work very quickly, and they tend to be very reinforcing. Nicotine, the active ingredient in most cigarettes and tobacco, is one of the most addictive substances out there. It is very difficult, and I'm sure some of you have known people, or maybe even yourself, who've tried to quit smoking. Nicotine is incredibly addictive, much more so than many of the other drugs that are out there. Really, really interesting. I read a whole book on it. I forget what it's called, but talking about the like cultural and political history of nicotine versus marijuana. And if it had been switched, marijuana is way less dangerous and less addictive than nicotine. But nicotine was like part of like all of our political and economic background, if you go way back with in time. And so nicotine is legal, but it's one of the most addictive substances. It works very, very quickly. It's like less than 5 seconds for it to take effect. And so it tends to be very addictive for people. One of the most commonly used stimulants, other than like caffeine, of course. Yeah. Yeah, so vaping, really interesting. Vaping actually has a lot of dangers to it as well. It tends to be viewed as less dangerous. And the research on that is a little bit mixed, but there's so many substances in those products, right? And like if you read the labels of them, it's actually kind of frightening. And so people have had a lot of issues with vaping, assuming that it's less dangerous. It's a little less dangerous for other people, right? Because the effects of like secondhand smoke are worse in general than like the effects of vaping. But yeah, it has a lot of risks as well. And it often contains nicotine or other substances, depending on the brand and the type. So yeah, it has the same risks, but then you're also add like unpredictable chemicals that are in a lot of those products as well. Yeah.
Into the addiction too, because of like the fruity flavor that you get.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So I just think that.
Yeah, or the like trendiness of it sometimes is another like factor, right? Yeah, I mean, if you enjoy the way that something makes you feel and you enjoy the taste of it, right? Or like the way that like it smells or tastes or whatever, like whatever like sensory experience of it, I mean, then it's going to be even more addictive in a way, right? And so oftentimes that's adds another layer that people have to struggle with. The last group, hallucinogens. Sometimes called like psychedelic drugs or mind manifesting drugs. These are drugs that tend to cause people to have a distorted visual or like auditory or sensory perception in some way, where you are experiencing things in the absence of sensory input. So maybe you're seeing things that aren't there or hearing things that aren't there, feeling things that aren't there, having distorted beliefs about reality. These tend to be viewed as a more dangerous class of drugs, though marijuana technically falls into this category. It's kind of a mixed drug, actually. So it's a mild hallucinogen, but it falls in here because it tends to distort people's perception, especially of like time and like speed of processing. But LSD, there's a lot of drugs that fall into this category, tending to cause you to see or hear or experience things that aren't necessarily there. Yeah.
When it comes to the auditory perception, could that mean that we could hear things from like, let's say if it's coming from the right, could you hear from the left?
It could be, I mean, well, typically, so in the most traditional form, it's just like, that you might hear things that aren't happening at all. Right, but it obviously depends on which drug you're taking and how much of it you've taken, but maybe hearing things in a distorted way, not unheard of at all, right? Or seeing things in a distorted way. I went to Humboldt State. That's all I'm just like, if you know Humboldt's reputation, I did not, right? Believe me or not, well, that doesn't matter. I went up there for the trees. So the other greenery, right? I went up there because I thought it looked beautiful. I love the rain and the cold. I was actually a very sheltered kid. So I had no idea that it had a reputation for marijuana until I got up there. And then it was everywhere. It was like literally everywhere. And I was unprepared for it. Like if you got caught smoking it in the dorms, it was like a $20 fine. And we joked that you paid it to your like RA because it wasn't a big deal. Like it was really bizarre. It was such a culture up there. But oftentimes, people describing, or I've even seen this a million times in the people that I lived with in the dorms, it does tend to distort your perception, right? Oftentimes slowing things down. Sometimes people can have very like intense reactions where they hallucinate. It really depends on the type that you're consuming, how you consumed it, how much of it that you did. But these in general do tend to alter your sensory perception. And some of them are a little more dangerous than others. On LSD, people often do things because they have false beliefs about reality, jumping off of a bridge because they feel like they can fly, right? I mean, and that's not unheard of on LSD, having like a bad trip that way. So these tend to be viewed as more severe, though this one is the most frequently used illegal drug in the United States. And it depends where you live as to whether or not it's actually illegal. It's the most complicated legally by far. And so depending on where you live, there's rules on how much you can possess or not possess in order to maintain that legality. But it has an incredibly long history, and it actually has a lot of like medicinal and positive uses as well, in addition to dangers and side effects that can come with it. So again, that's about as like far as we'll go into these different substances. And if you wanted to know more, you could definitely learn so much more. But what we'll focus on, and we'll start this next class because I have to end in just a couple of minutes here. What we'll focus on next class is we'll talk about substance use disorder. That's really the one big disorder in this chapter, right? That people can have a problematic relationship with a drug, or they can have drugs cause other issues. So that's what we'll do on Thursdays. We'll look at all the different symptoms of substance use disorder, which actually combines two disorders into one. In the DSM-4, they were separate, and now we have one disorder. And then we'll look at a case study to kind of get some examples of what this can look like and identify symptoms. So I'm sorry to end early, but yeah, was asked to attend a meeting this morning, regardless of my class schedule. So I'm sorry about that. But what we'll do, as I said, is we'll pick up here. Please remember that the exam is on Tuesday. So start thinking about it and preparing. The study guide is on Canvas already. If you wanted to do that, you will have your notes in both, but it's probably still a really good idea to start studying a little bit for that. I'll hang out. I have a few more minutes. I'll hang out up here if you have any questions about that or your papers, which are coming up in a week or two. Otherwise, I will see you all on Thursday. Don't forget to wear green, right? So you don't get pinched. Hi, what's up?
2 questions.
Yes.
I just wanted to like keep you updated that